Nolan Steele placed the divorce papers on his boardroom table, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed the gesture. He didn't slide them across dramatically. That would suggest emotion, and Nolan did not do emotion in rooms where deals were made. He simply set them down, uncapped a pen, placed it alongside them, and looked at the woman sitting across from him. With the polite, professional detachment he reserved for Verns, he no longer needed. "Legal's already confirmed the terms," he said. "Your signature goes on page 7 and the back of page 12. He was already reaching for his phone before Hazel Morrow finished, pulling the document toward her. He didn't see her hands go very still above the paper. He didn't see the way she looked at the pen for a long, quiet second before she picked it up. He didn't see the particular expression on her face, not grief, not resignation, but something cleaner and more final than either of those things. The expression of a woman who has been carrying a weight for 2 years and has, in this exact moment, put it down. If you're watching from Canada, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where you are. Subscribe to Ivory's Secrets if you haven't already. And, please, don't go anywhere, because what Nolan Steele was about to discover in the next 60 seconds was going to cost him more than he had earned in the last decade, and he had earned quite a lot. The morning Nolan decided to finalize the divorce, he woke up feeling efficient. That was the word that stayed with people later, when the whole story found its way into the circles where such stories travel. The financial press, the quiet conversations at industry dinners, the kind of talk that happens in corners at fundraisers when someone's name comes up, and the room shifts almost imperceptibly. Not satisfied, not relieved, efficient, as though 9 years of marriage to another human being had become an item on his task list, and crossing it off would free up bandwidth for more important work. He showered. He put on the gray suit Jade had told him looked best in morning meetings. He drank the coffee his housekeeper had left on the counter, and did not glance at the garden outside the kitchen window where the November frost still hadn't fully lifted from the raised beds along the fence line. He had stopped looking at that garden some time ago, in the way that people stop noticing things they have decided are no longer relevant to their lives. Hazel had planted that garden in their second year in the house, ferns and salal and a wide bed of native wildflowers that bloomed for exactly 6 weeks every July, and which she photographed every single year, in more or less the same spot, in more or less the same light. She'd told him once, standing at the back door with soil still on her hands, that the garden was teaching her patience, that the most valuable things took the longest to show themselves. He'd said something vague and affirming, and gone back inside to his laptop. He had not thought about that conversation again until much later. Nolan Steele had built Steele Development Group over 11 years, from a 2-person operation in Gastown to one of the more recognized mid-market development firms in the lower mainland. He was genuinely, substantively good at his work. At reading land, at structuring deals, at finding the angle other people missed. He worked long hours not from insecurity, but because the work was, in his own honest assessment, the most interesting thing about him. Hazel had been the second most interesting thing once. He'd been 29 when they met at a gallery opening in Yaletown. She was quiet and dry-humored, and knew more about the pieces on the wall than anyone else in the room, including the artist. He'd asked her for a drink. She'd said she'd already had 2 and was heading out, but he could walk with her if he happened to be going in that direction. He was not, but he walked with her anyway. All the way to the seawall, and somewhere in that walk he'd understood that this was not a person he wanted to let leave his line of sight. That version of his marriage, the early version, the seawall version, had been real. He had loved Hazel Morrow with the full, uncomplicated attention of a man who had not yet learned to ration himself. The problem, as is so often the case, was success. Not the success itself exactly, more the version of himself that grew up inside it. The first major project, the first profile in a trade publication, the first time someone used the word visionary in a room he was standing in, and he felt the word land differently than he'd imagined, not hollow, but weighty, like something settling into place. He had started slowly, and then all at once, becoming the person the word described. And the person the word described had increasingly little patience for a wife who gardened and read, and had no particular interest in being seen at industry events. He'd told himself this was incompatibility. It was a kinder word than the true one. Jade Whitfield had joined the firm 18 months ago as a development strategist. She was sharp and relentlessly prepared, and had the quality Nolan most admired in people. She was always already thinking about the next thing. In his company, that quality produced results. In his personal life, it produced something he chose not to examine closely. The morning of the signing, Jade was already in the boardroom when Hazel arrived. There was no professional reason for her to be there. Nolan had told himself she was present because she'd helped structure the asset division, which was technically true and almost entirely beside the point. Hazel walked in with a woman named Cecily Lowe, her personal solicitor, who had a quiet but serious practice specializing in high-value family law. Nolan had assumed Hazel found her through a friend's referral. He had not looked more carefully than that. He should have looked more carefully. Hazel sat down without glancing at Jade. She did not look at Jade once during the entire proceeding. She said Nolan's name in the steady, unremarkable way she had of saying things, and then she pulled the document toward her, and she read it. She actually read it, all 12 pages, while Nolan's legal counsel, a man named Houghton, who billed at rates that made accountants wince, made the usual noises about fairness and the considerable generosity of the settlement being offered. The Whistler property alone, Houghton began, represents. I know what it represents, Hazel said. A pause. My client, Cecily said, settling her own file on the table with the ease of someone who was not in the least bit hurried, declines the settlement. The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when something unexpected has entered them. Hazel, Nolan started. The property, the liquid assets, the vehicle? No, thank you, she said it, without drama, without heat. She turned a page and continued reading. I'd like the divorce finalized as quickly as the process allows, that's all. What Nolan felt in that moment was not concern. It was confusion, the specific confusion of a man who has accurately predicted every move of a negotiation, and then watched the other party pick up a piece he didn't know was on the board. He pressed forward the way he always pressed forward, with the composure of a man who believes his authority over a room is structural, not earned. If that's what you want, let's proceed. She picked up the pen. She signed her name. Not Hazel Morrow. Hazel Caldwell. The pen made a small, clean sound against the paper. She set it down. She looked up at Nolan, and the expression on her face was not triumph and it was not anger. It was the particular clarity of someone who has made a decision that cost them something real and has decided, with full awareness, to carry that cost. Houghton looked at the signature. He looked at it for 2 full seconds without speaking, which for a man of his experience was itself a form of alarm. Caldwell, he said. His voice was carefully empty of inflection. That's correct, Cecily said pleasantly. The room was very still. I don't, Nolan stopped. What does that mean? Nobody answered him right away. Cecily was already closing her file. She looked at Hazel, who nodded once. Cecily stood, gathered her things with the unhurried efficiency of some who had nothing left to do in this room, and excused herself. In the corridor outside, she made a phone call that lasted 38 seconds. That call would reach the right people before noon. Nolan was still staring at the signature when Jade touched his arm and said his name, quietly. He did not look up. He was trying to remember, going back through 9 years of dinners and arguments, and quiet, Sunday mornings, and firm anniversary parties, if he had ever, in any context, heard the name Caldwell attached to Hazel. He could not find a single instance. Because Hazel Caldwell, who had loved a hungry young developer named Nolan Steele in a rented condo in Gastown more than 9 years ago, had been very, very careful. You need to understand what Nolan never did. You need to understand what kind of woman had been sitting across from him at dinner for nearly a decade. The Caldwell family did not appear in Vancouver magazine's wealth features. They did not host charity galas under their own name or cut ribbons at project launches or show up in the breathless real estate coverage that ran every spring about who was building what and for how much. The Caldwell name appeared, if it appeared at all, buried inside holding company filings and blind trust disclosures, and the sort of documentation that requires a specific kind of attention to locate. Bernard Caldwell, Hazel's grandfather, had begun acquiring land in British Columbia in the 70s, before anyone was paying close attention to the patterns of a quiet, methodical man who moved with the patience of someone who understood that real wealth was never in what was happening now, but in what was going to happen next. His son, Hazel's father, Lionel Caldwell, had continued the work, more deliberately, more diversely, with holdings that now extended into infrastructure, renewable energy corridors across the interior, and a private investment arm operating through 6 subsidiary entities with no publicly visible connection to the family. The combined portfolio was not a number that appeared anywhere. The 3 people who understood its full shape kept that understanding very close. Hazel was Lionel's only child. She had grown up watching people transform into different versions of themselves the moment the Caldwell name entered a room. She had watched friendships bend under the weight of what the name represented. And when she was 26 and genuinely, for the first time in her adult life, uncertain whether a man she was falling for was seeing her or seeing the background she'd carefully omitted, she had made a decision. She had stayed as Hazel Morrow, her mother's name, the name on her everyday ID, her studio memberships, her artist portfolio. She had wanted to know what it felt like to be loved without the context. Just once, just to know. For 5 years, she had been certain she'd been right to try. The 6th year was when things began to shift. She could trace it with the precision that comes from watching something you love. Change the way you watch weather move in off the water. Slowly, then all at once. The first major project. The first time Nolan's name appeared in print with the word visionary. The first industry dinner, where a woman looked at Hazel and then at Nolan and her expression asked, plainly, and without embarrassment, what exactly the connection was. Hazel watched her husband change the way you watch, a good season turn. And she kept finding reasons, the pressure of scaling, the complexity of the new partnerships, the particular exhaustion of being the person in every room that everyone was looking to for direction. The night she stopped finding reasons was the night of Steele Development's 6th anniversary gala at a hotel in Cole Harbor. She had worn a dress she loved, deep burgundy, simple, with her grandmother's earrings. She had come downstairs and Nolan had looked at her and said, not cruelly, just with the tone of a man whose attention was already somewhere else, "Is that the plan for tonight?" She went back upstairs and changed into something she didn't love. She stood at the edge of the gala all evening, holding a glass of sparkling water, and watching Jade Whitfield lean toward her husband at the precise angle that communicated, to anyone who knew how to read rooms, that she had made some kind of private decision. Hazel left early. She took her own car. She sat in the driveway of their house in the dark for a long time before going inside. Then she called her father. Lionel Caldwell had been waiting. Not anxiously, but with the specific readiness of someone who has known a call was coming and has already begun thinking about what comes next. She told him everything. She had not told him the truth in a long time because she was stubborn and private and did not want to be the daughter who couldn't manage her own life. But that night she was tired, and she told him. When she finished, Lionel was quiet for a long moment. "You know I've never asked you to prove anything," he said. "I know. And you know you can come home any time." "I know that too." Another pause. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was dark. The November city was quiet, in the particular way it gets after midnight when the rain has stopped and everything is still damp and still. 6 months, she said finally. "I just need 6 months." She spent those 6 months doing something Nolan, had he known, would not have credited her with Not because he thought her incapable of strategy, but because he had stopped thinking about her at all. She spent them creating a clean separation between every quiet advantage his firm had unknowingly benefited from through their connection to her family, because she had been there quietly and the Caldwell name, unspoken, invisible, carries weight in certain rooms. Yes, she had used that weight exactly twice in 9 years. Once, very early, when a financing arrangement that should have closed didn't, and a quiet word through the right channel reopened it. Once, 3 years later, when a competitor attempted a land play against Nolan's flagship project, and found that 3 of the necessary municipal relationships were, inexplicably, unavailable to them. Nolan had attributed that second outcome to his own strategic foresight. Hazel had not corrected him. Now she spent 6 months ensuring that when she stepped back completely. No lingering buffer, no invisible goodwill. Just Nolan alone in the market, he believed he had conquered entirely by himself. She did not do this out of anger. That was the part people struggled to understand later, when the story became the kind of story that gets discussed. She was not angry, she was grieving. There is a meaningful difference and it matters. Anger is hot and it moves forward. Grief is the weight of a thing that was real and is now finished. It is the weight of choosing the honest version of your own life over the comfortable fiction of a marriage that has already quietly ended. In the small hours of too many nights, in the accumulated distance between 2 people sitting in the same room. She was grieving the man from the seawall. That man had not gradually worsened. He had simply been buried by degrees and choices in the slow sediment of a decade of success. What was sitting across from her in that boardroom was a stranger wearing his face, and she could not stay married to a stranger simply because she still remembered who he had been. So when Nolan set those papers on the table that November morning, Hazel Caldwell did not cry. She did not argue. She did not catalog her grievances or remind him of every evening she had spent believing in his work when the people around him were still unconvinced. She picked up the pen and she signed her real name, and she walked out of that building into the cold Vancouver morning, and she called her father. "It's done," she said. "Good," Lionel said, without ceremony, without excess. "Come home." Back in the boardroom, Nolan was still looking at the paper when his phone buzzed. Then his second phone, the one reserved for partners, for the institutional names that represented the structural weight of everything he had built. He turned around from the window and looked at Houghton, who was looking at his own screen with an expression Nolan had never seen on that face before. "The Burrard Corridor deal," Houghton said slowly. He stopped, started again. "The 3 anchor partners, they've withdrawn." "All 3? Simultaneously, within the last 40 minutes. Nolan stared at the papers, his signature, her signature, both permanent, already processed, done. He turned the name over in his mind. Hazel Caldwell. Like a word in a language he almost recognized but could not place. He tried to trace it backward, through 9 years of evenings and conversations and studio visits and dinners, with her quiet, unhurried father, who came to Vancouver twice a year and never seemed to need anyone in the room to know what he did. He could not find the thread, because Hazel had been careful, and because he had stopped looking at her so completely that he had simply never thought to ask. His project lead called, then his equity partner, then his banker, on a Friday morning, which was never a good sign. The Burrard Corridor partners had not cited a cause. Their withdrawal was clean, formal, complete. Nolan's team spent the next 4 hours trying to find a connection between 3 separate entities in 3 corners of the industry who had all within 40 minutes of a divorce being finalized, arrived at the same position. They found the connection by early afternoon. Caldwell Capital Holdings had issued a private notice to its professional network, not a press release, not a public statement. 43 words. A quiet communication to a select group of contacts, noting that the informal, relational landscape surrounding Steele Development Group had materially changed, and that historical courtesies extended through certain channels should no longer be assumed to be standing. 43 words. It reached the right people before noon. By end of day, Nolan's lender relationships had flagged for review. By the following Monday, 2 institutional partners were openly reconsidering their positions. In a house on the Saanich Peninsula that appeared on no public property registry, Lionel Caldwell was sitting across from his daughter at a table that had held the most important conversations of 2 generations. He did not look up from what he was reading. "We're not attacking anything," he said. "We're clarifying what was always true." Hazel wrapped both hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention. Outside, the Douglas firs along the property line stood still in the November quiet. She had not been in this house since the previous Christmas. It felt in the particular way of childhood places, both smaller and more true than she remembered. "He'll think it's retaliation," she said. Lionel looked up then. His eyes were the same particular shade of gray as hers, the color of the Georgia Strait before rain. "What you're doing isn't retaliation," she said. "It's reality adjusting to the truth." "Then let it adjust," he said quietly. She knew he was right. She also knew Nolan well enough to know he would spend the first week looking for someone to blame, the second week trying to identify the mechanism, and the third week beginning, slowly, with great resistance, to understand something he would find very difficult to sit with. That the foundation of the company he believed he had built entirely by himself had never been entirely his. Not fraudulently, not even consciously. But the rooms that had been easy to enter, the partnerships that had come without the usual friction, the particular smoothness of certain early negotiations, those conditions had existed in the specific climate that the Caldwell name, even unspoken, even unknown, produces in certain professional environments. And Hazel had let it happen, not strategically, simply because it was the weather of her life, and she could not fully turn it off. Now she was turning it off. And somewhere in a glass-walled office in Vancouver with his phone ringing and his partner's messages going unanswered, Nolan Steele was beginning to understand, for the first time, what the weather had always been. He did not call her for 11 days. He thought about it, decided against it, and then one morning, before he talked himself out of it again, he called Cecily Lowe's office. Hazel called him back herself. Her voice was the same. He hadn't thought about that specifically, hadn't thought about the voice, apart from everything else it represented, and then he heard it and felt, very suddenly, the full weight of 9 years, landing in the space of a single second. He had prepared remarks. He was good at prepared remarks. He had made a living on the ability to enter difficult conversations with a structure already in place. What came out instead was, "I didn't know." A silence, 2 seconds, 3. "I know you didn't," she said. "That was the point." He stopped. He had been thinking about it as information that had been withheld from him. He had not been thinking about the fact that she had withheld it deliberately, which meant she had wanted to be loved without it, which meant she had been hoping for a specific thing from him, specifically, and he had spent 9 years not providing it. "The Berard partners," he said, because he didn't yet know how to say what he actually meant. "My father made some calls," she said. "He wasn't protecting anything that was ever yours, Nolan. He was clarifying what had always been his. I didn't ask him to. I didn't stop him either." He was quiet. "You're going to be all right," she said. "The company is real. The work is real. Build from that. Stop relying on conditions you didn't create." "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in months," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." The call ended. He stood in his corridor and held the phone and let the conversation settle around him. The way you let something settle when you understand that rushing through it won't make it any smaller. What Hazel built in the months that followed, while Nolan restructured and renegotiated and without any buffer, what his firm was actually worth in a room where no quiet doors had been opened on his behalf, was something she had been preparing for a long time. Caldwell Creative Group launched in the spring, not a press release. A presentation, held in a restored heritage building in Victoria, attended by 200 people who understood what they were looking at. Hazel stood at the front of the room in a dark green blazer, without notes, without a podium, looking like exactly herself, the clearest, most settled version of herself. And she spoke for 40 minutes about place and permanence, and the ethics of building in a landscape that has always belonged to more people than the ones who profit from it. She talked about her family's history in British Columbia, about the land her grandfather had watched and learned, and waited on before he put a single dollar into it, about what it means to hold generational wealth honestly, and the particular damage done when it is held carelessly. She did not mention Nolan. She didn't need to. The platform she announced, a development, consulting and land stewardship model, operating under the Caldwell umbrella, structured to work alongside indigenous landholders and municipal bodies in ways the industry hadn't seen formalized quite this way, drew responses from the room that were not polite applause. They were the responses of people who recognized something real. Nolan watched the live stream from his office with the door closed and his calls held. He watched his ex-wife stand in front of a room of people who were leaning toward her, not performing, not selling. Simply present in the way that people are present when they have been thinking carefully about something for a very long time and have finally found a room ready to receive it. And he felt something he had to sit with before he could name it. Pride. Not the kind that belongs to you, the kind that belongs to someone else, and that you feel, anyway, because you knew them before the world caught up. He felt proud of her, and underneath that, with a quietness that was not dramatic but was very heavy, he felt the full shape of what he had been looking at for 9 years without seeing. He had decided who Hazel Morrow was in the first year and spent 8 more years living with that decision. He had told himself she was uncomplicated. He had told himself she was out of place in his world. He had never once considered that perhaps she wasn't out of place in his world, that perhaps she already had one of her own, one that made his look, by comparison, like a very ambitious beginning. The restructuring took 14 months. Real work, harder than anything the firm had done in its early years, because this time there was nothing smoothing the friction. No quiet alignment of interests in rooms he hadn't known about. Just the work and his team and the genuine quality of what they had built when they had been building honestly. Janine Archer, who had been his director of acquisitions for 6 years, and who had been quietly considering leaving. For the last 2 of them stayed. She told him, 6 months into the new structure, that the firm felt different. He asked her how. She said it felt like a place where people believed the work mattered to the person at the top. He said, "It does." She said, "I know, that's the difference." He thought about that conversation for a long time. He thought about Hazel standing in the garden in the early years, about patience, and the things that take longest to show themselves, about how many times she had said something true, and he had heard something convenient. He had spent 9 years being very good at hearing what he needed to hear. He was learning, later than he should have, how to actually listen. They were at the same conference the following October, an urban development summit in Toronto, large enough that their schedules were unlikely to intersect unless one of them chose to make it happen. She chose to walk by the room where his panel was finishing. He saw her in the corridor after, near the registration tables. She said his name, he said hers, and they stood in the particular suspended space of 2 people who have a shared history and are deciding in real time what to do with it. "Your panel," she said, "the thing you said about building in conditions you didn't create. Someone told me about it." "Your presentation in Victoria," he said. "I watched the stream." "I know," she said. "I saw the view count." He almost smiled. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A complete one, not the version I gave you on the phone. That one was sincere, but it wasn't finished. I hadn't yet understood what I was apologizing for." She waited. "I failed to see you," he said, "not your family, or your capabilities, or your name. You, the actual person. I looked at you every day and saw what I had decided you were, and I never revisited that decision because you never demanded that I did. And I mistook your patience for evidence that nothing needed my attention. He looked at her directly. You deserved to be seen clearly. You deserved someone who tried to know you. I didn't do that, and I understand. Now that the damage wasn't what I didn't know about you, it was what I stopped bothering to look for. She was very still for a long moment. I'm not angry at you, she said, and she meant it. I grieved for a long time, for the man from the seawall, the one I thought was going to stay. A pause. But I understand now that he was always still there. He's standing here right now. He just spent a long time being someone else's idea of who he should become. He held that. He held it carefully, the way you hold something offered unexpectedly. That's not nothing, he said quietly. No, she said, it isn't. They talked for another half hour. About the industry, about what both of them were building, about the strange, specific experience of operating in overlapping professional spaces with someone you once made coffee for every morning without thinking about it. At one point he said, Are we going to find ourselves across the table from each other eventually? She considered it honestly. Probably. Caldwell Creative is interested in different territory than steel development. But BC is a small province in the ways that matter. Good, he said. She looked at him. You're going to make the work better, he said. You already have. Having a serious person doing serious things in the same space clarifies what you actually stand for. He said it without irony, without performance. I want to find out what I actually stand for. Something moved across her face. Recognition. The expression of someone who is seeing something they had hoped for without fully expecting it. That, she said quietly, is the most like yourself you've sounded since before the 6th anniversary gala. He didn't defend himself, he didn't redirect it, he let it be true. I'm working on it, he said. I know you are, she said, that's what I mean. Her assistant appeared at her shoulder with the quiet, professional timing of someone managing a schedule. Hazel looked at Nolan. Take care of yourself, she said. She meant it with the gravity of someone who spent 9 years saying it as a responsibility, and is now, for the first time, saying it as a wish. You too, he said. She turned and walked toward the dinner that was waiting for her, toward the people who were building something real alongside her, toward the life she had constructed out of patience and silence, and the long, unwitnessed courage of a woman who knew her own, worth long before the world agreed with her. He watched her go, not with longing only, but with the particular clarifying vision of someone who can now see what they could not see before, and has decided that the clarity, even arriving this late, is still worth having. He put his phone in his pocket. He thought about a garden on a November morning he had stopped looking at, about patience, about the things that take longest to show themselves. He had spent 9 years looking without seeing. He was going to spend a long time making sure he never made that mistake again. And somewhere in a car moving through Toronto's October streets toward a dinner full of people who were building something that mattered, Hazel Caldwell looked out the window at the lit-up city. Going by and felt, in the quiet, unhurried way of someone who has finally arrived in a life that is entirely her own, that she was exactly where she was always meant to be. There are people who spend their whole lives waiting to become someone worth noticing. Hazel Caldwell was always that person. She simply stopped waiting for the wrong man to open his eyes long enough to see it.